For those who don't know me, I'm Muriel Schmid, and I'm the Director of Religious Studies here on campus at the University of Utah, and I'm Assistant Professor in the Department of Languages and Literature. And I've been I don't know my title about the conference, but I guess I was the head of the organizing committee or something like that. I don't know if there is a specific title for it, but it's been really a great experience over the past year almost to be part of this conversation and to bring this event together and to see it now live and happening. So I'm welcoming everyone, and especially our next round of speakers. We have three out-of-towner speakers, which is very exciting. And we're going to proceed. The panel is Peacebuilding and Cultural Values. So it's the second panel of our day, and we're going to proceed as follows. So each of them is going to give a 25-minute presentation talk. I'll introduce each of them as we go, and at the end, hopefully, we'll have some time for Q&A for everyone. So if you have a question for the first speaker, just write it down and keep track of it so that you can ask the question at the very end of the panel. So our first speaker is Professor John Carlson, and the title of his presentation is The American Way of Religion and Violence. And Professor Carlson is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Arizona State University, where he's also the Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict. His research explores how religious and ethical ideas invigorate our understanding of political life. He writes on issues of war and punishment and peace, religion and violence, and a variety of social and political issues, including human rights, capital punishment, and war crimes tribunal. He received his MA and PhD in religious ethics from the University of Chicago Divinity School. And before coming to the Arizona State University, he was a founding member of the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life and a research fellow at the University of Notre Dame. Aside from the publication of numerous scholarly articles, Professor Carlson is co-editor and contributor to 3 books, and the most recent one is called From Jeremiah to Jihad, Religion, Violence, and America, and it just came out in 2012 with the University of California Press. He's also currently completing a monograph entitled Justice, This Side of Heaven, Human Nature, Religion, and the Moral Order of Politics, which explores how beliefs about God and human nature shape our political conception of justice. So his contribution will bring us back to this discussion of religion and conflict and the role of religious beliefs in American political life. So I'll welcome John Carlson for his presentation.
Good morning, and thank you, Muriel, for the introduction. I'd like to extend my thanks also to Tom Maloney for inviting me to participate at this conference, and to the Tanner Center, of course, and all the organizers who helped make it possible. These are manifestly important issues that are before us today, and I'm honored to be able to contribute to it. Now, having said that, I looked over at the conference program and all of the talks on peace and nonviolence and conflict resolution, and I wondered whether I was at the right conference because my work focuses on rather unlovely matters of war and violence and rebellion and the like. But Muriel assured me that I was in the right place. That was you being reassuring. That was your reassuring voice, right, Muriel? Okay, good. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, so hopefully you won't be mesmerized by the blue screen and put to sleep. I'll try to keep things lively. Having just published a book subtitled Religion, Violence, and America, what I'd like to do is show how that cluster of themes is relevant to our proceedings today. For the themes are embedded in this conference, in the cultural context in which we take place, and all kinds of academic forays about violence and peacemaking. And we tend to think about violence and religion over there. in other parts of the world, the Middle East, the Balkans, India, without giving much attention to our own history of religion and violence. So I think we do well to think about how we conceive those terms and to how we think about them and look out onto the world, because these terms are also critical, of course, to how others look onto us. The title of my paper is The American Way of Religion and Violence with a question mark at the end, and I think that's important. So I want to explore several different meanings of that term, and I'll be drawing upon my book, which is a multi-authored collection that I've edited with a colleague who's a historian. As Muriel mentioned, I'm a religious ethicist. Now, I mention all of this up front so that you know the sources I'm drawing from, how I come to these ideas, and where you could learn more about them. I want to make clear I'm certainly not using this conference as an occasion to promote my book. That would be very tacky. But for those of you who are interested or were planning to purchase the book anyway, I did want to mention, I think there's some flyers, some snazzy flyers floating around that include a discount coupon on them, so you can find them out in the lobby. Let me begin with one account of the way of religion and violence that's probably familiar to many people's minds. And those of you who grew up watching the Superman series, the one starring George Reeves, so I'm going a little ways back here, will remember the show's opening. Now, I'm not talking about those lines about faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, but rather Superman's never-ending battle for truth, justice, and the American way. Now, that American way bit was not always part of the original Superman show, and if you know that because you grew up listening to the radio show in the 1940s, my hunch is that you're probably not really eager to advertise that. That's how you know that. Rather, the American way bit was, the tagline was added in the 1950s, in the era of McCarthyism, the decade that under God became part of the Pledge of Allegiance, and that the threat of godless communism took on new urgency. Now, whether neither Superman nor anyone else defined the American way with any precision, it was certainly understood to be consonant with truth and justice, forming perhaps a triad or even a trinity. And whether anyone recognizes that trinity as holy or as secular, I think matters little, but we are talking about a superhuman figure here who's omnipotent, all-seeing, who comes to help save us in the world. The vagueness of the American way in the show or beyond it does not mean, of course, that this concept has no content. The American way owes to a certain affinity with political ideals of equality, democracy, as expressed in the Declaration, for example. And, of course, Superman was a great foe of the tyrants who were thirsting after power, after glory, after domination. Of course, more broadly than the comics, the American way is associated with economic ideals of capitalism, with progress, with economic prosperity, innovation, and of course there are American social values, self-reliance, human dignity, benevolence. In Will Herberg's words of 1955, above all, the American is idealistic. Americans cannot go on making money or achieving worldly success simply on its own merits. Rather, according to the American mind, it must be justified in higher terms of service, of stewardship, of general welfare. And because they are so idealistic, Americans tend to be moralistic. They are inclined to see all things as plain and simple, black and white, issues of morality. Now, if you're wondering still where religion is in all of this, this is from Herberg's classic Protestant Catholic Jew. Right? The idealism and the moralism of which Herberg is speaking, of course, deeply informed by religious idioms and thought, but it is, of course, his view that these different religions are united, forming sort of a common faith here. Now, this American way also harks back to John Winthrop's biblical invocation of the city upon a hill, in which the Massachusetts Bay founder and governor declared that the eyes of the world are upon us. Or one could also invoke the motto, or one of the mottos of the American Revolution: rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. proposed by Ben Franklin, supported by Thomas Jefferson, both deists. This refrain was accompanied by a seal, a very interesting one that features the famous Exodus scene in which Moses and the Israelites, having reached dry land, are watching as the Red Sea swallows up Pharaoh and his ensuing army. It was a proposed national emblem for a while. So one can look also to an array of sources and other sources and figures and events in American history to see how religious ideas have shaped how Americans think about themselves, about their country, and about their place in the world, particularly in and through moments of violence. So as a deeper illustration of this, let's look at some other famous Calvinist statesmen, not just John Winthrop or the Puritan Compacts, but a pair of Princeton Presbyterians, Woodrow Wilson, John Foster Dulles, both sons of ministers, and the foreign policy covenants that they made in their respective eras. And I have, as the son of a Presbyterian minister, and my father went to Princeton Theological Seminary, I'm aware that I sort of need to tread cautiously here, but I will do so anyway. There are certain features that unite these famous covenant makers, certain things that they have in common. They all believe that Americans were bound to the terms of a covenant in which God was sovereign. They all believe that Americans incurred a special responsibility to uphold the terms of this covenant and the acknowledgement of their chosen status, a special mandate that they enjoyed. They believe that those who failed to live up to the terms of the covenant of their day could expect punishment, enforcement, or retaliation that possessed some connection to a divine moral order. Averred Winthrop in his model of Christian charity, "If we shall neglect the observation of these articles, the Lord will surely break out in wrath against us and be revenged of such a perjured people, and make us know the price of the breach of such a covenant." Now, this is a classic articulation of what's sometimes called the American Jeremiad, which includes a threat of violence or actual violence that serves as punishment for failure to live rightly as the covenant demands. It also entails, though, an opportunity to repent and to recommit to the principles of it. One can see evidence of Jeremiadic thinking just a few decades later when in 1674 New England Puritans found themselves fighting the Wampanoag tribe led by their chief king, Philip. The Puritan ethic never entailed claiming credit for good fortunes that befell them, since all good things come from God, but in the case of misfortunes suffered, their sins were entirely to blame. So I'm going to read from a short passage from another author's chapter in my book. At times, God seemed to be punishing the New Englanders for their waywardness by inflicting violence upon them at the hands of King Philip's warriors. In one incident, a settler named Wright refused to seek shelter at the garrison, and when the Indians arrived instead, he had this strange confidence, or rather conceit, that whilst he held his Bible in his hand, he looked upon himself as secure from all kinds of violence, and that the enemy, finding him in that posture, deriding his groundless apprehension or folly therein, ripped him open and put his belly in his Bible. Wright's prideful approach to Scripture provoked God's wrath against him, making him the object of divine violence, and a cautionary example to others. Now, of course, this focuses on one particular individual, but it was far more common that the Jeremiah tradition involving chastening violence was interpreted by the entire community as punishment for collective sins. And we may think that the era of the American Jeremiad is well behind us, but those who listen to the rhetoric of the religious right after September 11th will recall Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, blaming not foreign terrorists, but a host of domestic elements, the ACLU, abortionists, pagans, gays, feminists, a lot, for subverting the divine ideals to which God has called Americans. There are also Jeremiads aplenty from the religious left, pastors such as Jeremiah Wright. And of course, Jeremiad goes back to the book of Jeremiah. That's where the term comes from. Jeremiah Wright preached that 9/11 was simply a case of chickens coming home to roost for various immoralities of U.S. foreign policy. Now, despite this focus on the extremes, covenantal and Jeremiah rhetoric, has been prominent in mainstream political thought as well, Wilson and Dulles, so I'm going to return to now. I read below from a chapter by my co-editor, John Ebel, who describes how Wilson sought to unite and mobilize the nation to fight in the Great War in Europe. President Wilson invoked the notion of covenant repeatedly in his public pronouncements on war, using it to establish in-group and out-group identities at home and abroad, and to shape understandings of how victory would be achieved and peace maintained. As he used covenant to unite and divide, he also used it to incite. As he used it to unite and pacify, he also used it to divide and to incite. He saw little room for those who, in Puritan terms, would not own the covenant. And he makes some examples of this in his second inaugural address, which is just 1 month before the U.S. enters the war. He says, "We are being forged into a new reality," these are Wilson's words, into a new unity amidst the fires that now blaze throughout the world. In their ardent heat, we shall, in God's providence, let us hope, be purged of faction and division. Decades later, while recovering from a Second World War, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles delivered similarly styled speeches not only to Americans seeking to unite Americans, renewing their covenant to universal moral principles, but also to unite and recommit the world to an international covenant. Dulles had been a drafter and delegate of the delegated signatory of the newly formed Charter of the United Nations. This was what Dulles saw as a new world covenant that, politically, institutionally speaking, stood the best chance of bringing the world in conformity with the moral order that would ensure God's will be done on earth. Now, if only the U.S. and its citizens could generate the spiritual power needed to create and sustain this world organization. Dulles had no doubt recalled the failures of the League of Nations, and he tried to appeal to Christian values to motivate support for the UN. In the author Ned O'Gorman's words, Christianity reinforces this vision of an expansive, universal covenant applicable to all mankind. This is not the kind of faddish bashing of the UN that's common today. In fact, Dulles repairs to the Jeremiah to condemn skeptics for their lack of faith in the UN's potential. The U.S. should be out front, exemplifying universal principles of the new international covenant. But of course, there are some downsides to, or other sides at least, to Dulles' rhetoric. Years later, in a famous 1954 speech, Dulles declared the U.S. willingness to use, quote, massive retaliation as a means of deterring Soviet aggression, a right to retaliate instantly and by means and place of our U.S. own choosing, end quote. Now, obviously, this raises the specter of nuclear attacks and war. And beyond the national security threats that the Soviets posed, Dulles' speech listed several grievances that violated the international covenant, the UDHR, the UN Charter, etc., denying the worship of God, the dictates of reason, freedom of speech, establishing a society premised on a police state and forced order, etc., forced labor, etc. The Soviet Union's international provocations and its domestic repression were merely two sides of the same coin, a coin that did not belong to the currency of the new international covenant. In sum, then, violence, real or imagined or threatened, enjoys long-standing, deep-running roots in soil that has a strongly religious dimension to it. Now, what I've been discussing here is an approach that considers how religion and violence have been part of what is loosely called the American way, the character, the ethos, its place in the world that Americans ascribe to themselves and to the United States. And this view is oftentimes associated with an understanding of American exceptionalism, that the U.S. has certain riches and certain opportunities, and that it possesses certain ideals, principles, and responsibilities in the world. Some may find a hint of the Superman complex here, or perhaps think of another line from a Spider-Man film, with great powers comes great responsibility. Now, for some people, this view of the American way is nothing to champion, for it masks some rather nefarious elements, including a deep reliance upon war. We are a people born of a revolution, a people who achieved nationhood really only through the Civil War, and whose history has been steeped in many wars, including the most recently wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other fields of battle in the war on terrorism, so-called. And there are chapters and discussions of this in my book. One scholar argues that the American culture is both exceptionally religious and exceptionally violent, and that's no coincidence. That this lethal cocktail has turned the U.S. into what he calls an empire of sacrifice, in which the pursuit of seemingly innocent domination underwrites blessed brutalities against marginalized peoples, minorities, Native Americans, African Americans, conquered peoples in other lands. Some authors in my book reach some similar kinds of conclusions, or at least conclusions that are similarly critical and suspicious, and we need that kind of approach. But whatever its merit, this reduces the American way to a kind of deluded Superman ethic, and becomes easy to overlook the nobler efforts of Winthrop, of Dulles, Wilson, and others, in spite of their failings. Put differently, Superman may be a fiction, but good and evil are not. What's needed is an approach that admits more nuance and restraint in the perennial pursuit of truth, justice, and other moral principles. And interestingly, I don't think we get that from another scholarly approach that I'll turn to now. As you probably know, there's been a lot of attention to the nexus of religion and violence in the last decade or more. Within the academy, within broader public discourse, there's been a cottage industry of religion and violence scholarship as well that has cropped up. Beyond the events of September 11th and terrorism and the war on terror, there's been discussions of culture clashes that have been generated or at least embodied in, cartoons or videotapes profaning the Prophet Muhammad, or mock trials of the Quran, just to name a few. And so numerous books have been written about religion's evil, violent propensities. Religious violence is somehow especially abhorrent and dangerous, we're told. It's absolutist. It imparts some cosmic significance to worldly problems. It promotes the demonization of enemies. And of course, out of a concern to highlight, equal opportunity fanaticism, most of these scholars observe that this phenomenon is not unique to Islam or somehow inherent or distinctive of it. Religious violence can be found in all faith traditions. For example, Christians, whether you're talking about Anders Breivik in Norway or militant anti-abortionists in the United States, have committed violence they justify in religious terms. So this equal opportunity approach found in much religious violence scholarship distinctively focused on fringe actors, sort of extreme elements, Al-Qaeda, Scott Roeder, who killed the abortion doctor George Tiller in Kansas, the Sikh temple killings. Right? Now, what's interesting is how focusing on religious extremism has now given way to a counter-movement of scholars I call the demythologizers of religious violence. They contend that we have disproportionately cast our eyes onto religion or religious people, even though most violence is carried out by secular governments and states. The secular is comparatively more violent than religion. Western scholars of religion have played a part in this by purveying the myth of religious violence, defining religion in ways that create certain distinctions between safe, rational, private religion that's held in check by the secular state and dangerous, irrational forms of religion that don't separate religion from politics. What this approach reveals, though, is how much violence of secular states, such as the United States, carry out against putatively dangerous religious minorities. And there's obviously some real insight to this approach. And I have a chapter in my book that makes this argument about the violence that the secular U.S. government has carried out against America's what I call religious others, whose failures to recognize the authority of the secular public divide, whereby secular norms tame religious beliefs. This has proven to be great threats to engines of American progress and industry and directions set by secular governments and rule of law. Now think here about violence carried out against Native Americans, Mormons, cults such as Branch Davidians, or even the enforcement efforts of the FLDS in my own state. In short, then, obsessing about religious violence is a subterfuge. Secular violence is the real problem, these scholars think. And we come to this insight by critically analyzing and unpacking the definitions about religion that we use and the uses to which they are put. In this mode of thinking, then, the American way of religion and violence is largely invisible because it parades under the mantle of the secular. But this approach, too, while necessary, is not a sufficient approach. We need some other ways of thinking about it. So as I close, because I think our time is wrapping up, let me suggest a third approach that recognizes, even synthesizes, and in some case hopes to go beyond the insights of the Superman myth on one hand or the religious violence myth on the other that I've talked about. Now, I'll just mention here 3 points that are developed and spelled out further in my book. Number 1, the American experience of religion and violence, as I said, did not begin on September 11th. There's a much longer history that needs to be told. But in reviewing that history carefully, at least, there is no bright line that separates religion from secular. And in some cases, these are anachronistic designations that sometimes obscure more than they actually reveal. As an example, the same violence against Mormons and Native Americans I mentioned a moment ago that one scholar labels as secular, another scholar persuasively argues, I think, are religious. So this is a debate we may well need to move beyond at some point. My chapter, for example, looks at the American Revolution and debates about whether it's a just war of independence or a holy war of independence. And that depends largely on what kinds of lenses one wears and what kinds of frameworks and presuppositions one brings to that. I try to put that in the context of Obama's Nobel Peace Prize address as a way of thinking about that in very contemporary terms. Point number 2, we would also do well to move beyond a false choice between focusing on violence by fringe actors and extremist elements, as some scholars do, and the violence carried out by the state on behalf of the majorities and the nation, as other critics argue. Rather, we can study militant figures and elements on the fringe, not simply for what they tell us about the militant few, but also for what they tell us about the many and the mainstream. Violence in America has often served as the fault line in American struggles between majority and minority, in efforts to define and expand consensus about what America will be or mean or represent, and who will be included under that rubric, and including who will have citizenship. Now, the case of anti-slavery militant John Brown is a classic illustration. He was viewed as a fanatic in his day, and he was. Yet his actions were a prelude to the epic struggle to preserve the nation, which ultimately cost 600,000 Americans their lives and ripped apart the social fabric of the country. Many view the actions of anti-abortionists like Scott Roeder similarly, extreme, fanatical, violent, beyond the pale. Yet his violence is but the tip of an iceberg, symbolizing a still unresolved debate in our country over the morality of abortion, and in the views of some people, a practice that they would describe as violence. Now, this brings me to a final point, and I want to remind you of the question mark at the end of my title. Well, many scholars of religion and violence have devoted significant attention deconstructing meanings and uses of the term religion or the secular. This literature has largely neglected any sustained effort to reckon seriously with the term violence. A term I would say is thrown around pretty loosely. We reduce violence to a kind of empirical phenomenon that requires little exploration. It's like that old definition of pornography, right? We know it when we see it. The reality, of course, is that violence is a term that is freighted with moral meaning. We can't do violence to someone or to something in a morally neutral way. Yet many scholars of religion and violence resist investigating or probing too deeply into these ethical concerns or layers. Beyond this, we also need to expand our lexicon and use other terms such as force, coercion, rebellion, revolution, and the various moral distinctions, just and unjust, good and evil, that can be brought to bear to evaluate them. It is better, I think, to acknowledge the moral status of these matters and to bring them forward, debate them, disagree about them if we need to. It's better to do that, I think, than to ignore them, since they are always operative in the background anyway. I'm proposing the value, then, of bringing history, sociology, and ethics together, as my colleagues have done in our project, where we crack open the moral questions that are raised in various historical cases or issues. In the end, figures as diverse as John Winthrop, John Brown, Abraham Lincoln, John Foster Dulles, and yes, even Martin Luther King all understood that efforts to form consensus and to define the principles and values that represent the American way necessarily involve conflict, struggle, and in many cases, violence and suffering. King understood this as well. American history suggests we ought not to ignore this reality. Yet it is only by incorporating some ethical concerns into our reflection upon that history and analysis that we can distinguish national disgrace, which must be shunned, from moral achievements that should be embraced. In undertaking this task, then, we should think carefully about what we mean by religion, of course, but more importantly than that, what we mean and associate with violence makes all the difference in the world. Thank you.
So our second speaker on this panel is Professor Stacey Horn. And before working at the university level at the University of Illinois in Chicago, she was for 20 years an English teacher in high school, and that's what actually brings her to her specialty at the University of Illinois in Chicago, where she is professor of educational and developmental psychology in the Department of Educational Psychology. And she's also affiliate faculty in community psychology and prevention sciences and program director of the Master of Education in Youth Development. Her research and publication focus on issues of sexual prejudice among adolescents, addressing the moral, social, and personal dimension of exclusion and peer harassment. Her current work, which is funded by the Ford Foundation, is investigating the development and contextual factors related to adolescents' reasoning and misogynistic and homophobic harassment in middle and high schools. And what's interesting for us is the project is actually in collaboration with Illinois Safe School Alliance, and the research will, at the end, inform policy and programmatic development aimed at reducing these types of harassment among young people. So the talk of Professor Horn this morning is entitled Values Difference Does Not Always Equal Conflict, Emerging Adults' Judgment Across Religious Identity. And I welcome Professor Horn.
I'm turning 45 this year, so hence the glasses changing. And just to clarify, I was not an English teacher for 20 years. I worked with young people for 20 years, but I would look pretty good if I had been an English teacher for 20 years, right? As Victoria is getting us organized here, I just want to thank the Tanner organizers and staff for inviting me to this great conference. I had the privilege of being a participant, an attendee of the conference on immigration and migration several years ago when I was here on my sabbatical, so it's nice to be back to actually be a presenter at the conference. I also want to thank Cecilia Wainrib, one of my good friends and colleagues, for introducing my work to the organizers of the committee. And need to extend deep gratitude to my two collaborators who are here with me today, Carolyn McNamara Berry from Loyola University of Maryland and Larry Nelson from Brigham Young University. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about them in a minute. And I will use the microphone. Let's see. So I have to admit I had a lot of angst in preparing for this talk, in part because I wasn't sure what insight I had to contribute to the conversation. I'm a developmental psychologist who studies social cognition and social reasoning about peer harassment, particularly related to issues of gender, sexual orientation, and gender identity expression, not a scholar of religion. I think because of that angst, my first approach to this talk was to rely very heavily on data and theory and to try my best to make it very academic. But what I realized through conversations with my collaborators, with Cecilia, with some of my students, was that what I really wanted to do today was to tell a very local and personal story that has led to a really exciting collaborative research project that I hope will somewhat humbly contribute to the larger and more global conversation regarding the topics of interest at this conference, religion, religious conflict, and peacemaking. So with that, what I plan to do in the next several minutes is to tell you the story of our collaboration and how it led to this research project, to share a little bit about the project because I can't do a talk without some data, and then the emerging ideas and themes that we are learning from the project, and then to finish with some questions that sort of were raised for me in the preparation of this talk that I hope will inform the larger discussion after the panel and throughout the day. So with that, let me begin with this story. A Catholic, a lesbian, and a Mormon end up in a doctoral comprehensive exam study group together. What do you think happens? So that's the story I'm going to tell you in the next couple minutes. In the second half of the 1990s, I was a graduate student at the University of Maryland in the Department of Human Development. I arrived in Maryland directly from Minnesota, where I might add we don't do conflict, so I'm ill-equipped to talk about it. Having recently come out as a lesbian, as a long-standing feminist, and someone who had a healthy distrust of, if not disdain, for organized religion. Upon arriving in Maryland, I was surrounded by more practicing Catholics and Jewish people than I had ever encountered in my entire life. Again, coming from Minnesota, while my exposure to Jewish people had been very limited, my attitudes towards and beliefs about Catholics were pretty negative. In the town where I grew up, Catholics were second-class citizens, perceived as slightly weird, ultra-conservative, and anti-women. Let me just say that when I got to Maryland, I had a strong general dislike of not only the Catholic faith, but also of Catholic people. I couldn't understand how anyone, especially smart women in a PhD program, for goodness sake, could ascribe to such backwards and hateful religion. And then, in my second year, I met Carolyn, a joyful, compassionate, intelligent first-year PhD student who was also openly Catholic and had just arrived on campus straight from her undergraduate program. Carolyn was relentlessly cheerful and optimistic and was as committed to the newly founded Human Development Graduate Student Organization as I was. Also that year, another student joined the program who was Mormon. At this point in my life, I'm not sure I even knew what Mormon was or had ever heard about it, let alone ever met one. What I knew was limited to the idea that Mormons were these sort of wacky, fundamentalist religious people. My initial reaction to Larry joining the program was complete certainty and conviction that we would hate each other. Fast forward a year, I find myself in a comprehensive exam study group with both Carolyn and Larry. By this time, we had had a couple of classes together, and Carol and I had become friendly colleagues through the graduate student government. So what happened? Through our many months of studying with each other, of discussing developmental theory and research, and of talking about our future aspirations, we all began to realize that we weren't actually all that different. In fact, I remember vividly a conversation between Larry and I about the fact that we could both be denied jobs in academia because of who we were, and that we could both be asked to hide a piece of ourselves due to institutional discomfort for who we were. It was during those months of studying, and eventually all passing our comprehensive exams, that we became friends. Who would have thought that these three very different people, a Catholic, a lesbian disdainer of religion, and a Mormon, would ever become friends? And that friendship has endured through all of us getting jobs at institutions that completely support who we are and allow us to be our whole selves, getting promotion and tenure, through marriages and civil unions, illness, babies and miscarriages, the finding of a faith home, and much, much more. The three of us have now been friends for over 15 years, a friendship for which I am truly grateful. Over the course of that time, as we see each other and share meals at conferences, we have continued to talk about what it was that allowed the three of us to not only become friends, but also to truly respect, love, and care about one another as colleagues and as human beings. And it was out of those conversations that our research collaboration grew. The initial purpose of the collaboration was to try to better understand individuals' attitudes, beliefs, and judgments about those from very different social identity groups that are often thought to be in conflict with each other, so for example, Mormons and lesbians, and how they make sense of their interactions with each other. So a little over 4 years ago, we began a project looking at issues of bias and stigma toward religiously identified people and lesbian and gay people. And we are really excited to be talking about this project for the first time, the very first time, here in Utah, and to be sharing some of our emerging results at this conference. So let me tell you about the project and what we've done and share a little bit of data, and then I have some questions for us. Just as a caveat, simply getting the IRB approval for this project took about 1.5 years from our 3 different institutions. So it has not been smooth sailing. So now I will turn, what did I do? So just to give you a little background of the conceptual framing, we are all psychologists, in particular developmental psychologists, so that's the work, that's the framework that sort of has informed this project. We also look at religion as a multidimensional construct that is both a set of beliefs and practices that individuals hold, an affiliation, a set of institutional connections, and so we think of religion in a sort of complex set of ways. And we also, at least from my perspective, think of religion as distinct from morality. So we use different theoretical models to look at sort of how religion is helping people make meaning versus sort of what we understand as the moral reasoning people are using, young people are using to make decisions about these intergroup contexts. And I would add here, we particularly chose to study emerging adults, in part because this is a particularly interesting time in terms of how people are making sense of religion as an autonomous individual, and also because it's sort of a transition time for people in lots of other ways in their lives. So we have collected data here in Utah, in Illinois, and in Maryland, primarily, with about 1,390 emerging adults between the ages of 18 and 24, and mostly mean age about 19.8. The sample is largely female, so when I show you data, keep that in mind, that it's about 3/4 female and only 1/4 male. It's also largely European American, with some diversity around Asian American, Latino students, and a much smaller population of African American students. We are still collecting data to try to get more African American students, more Protestants, more Muslims in the sample so that we can have a more rich data set, but that's in process. As you can see, the highest religious affiliation is LDS or Mormon students. I think they really like their extra credit, so they all took the survey, with then Catholics being the second highest affiliation. Students who don't affiliate with a religion at all, so don't have a religious affiliation, and then a much smaller Protestant and other categories. Largely straight, but we have now 6% LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual students, and again, we're trying to increase that sample as well. And I said mean age about 19.8. So let me talk about the religious measures, and then I'll talk about the social interaction measures we use. We asked students to fill out the Santa Clara Strength of Religious Faith measure and the Religious Life Inventory, which are two sort of measures of religiosity, but look at religiosity in very different ways. So how do people use religion in their everyday life, and how does religion organize how they make decisions in their lives? We also used a measure that's more about spirituality, so disconnected from a religious affiliation, how do people understand spirituality in their lives? And we also have a measure of religious fundamentalism that cuts across religious denominations. So it's not purely a Christian fundamentalism scale, but a more broad religious fundamentalism scale. And that really measures sort of how convicted are you that your religion is the right way to be, right? So in terms of the social judgment measures, we asked a ton of things. We have a lot of data, so I'm going to share a very small piece of it with you today. So we asked judgments and reasoning about excluding others, a very micro kind of conflict, right? I don't want to hang out with you. I don't want to be your friend. We also asked about bias-based joking. We asked about comfort interacting with others in a classroom, as a study partner, as a friend, and as a roommate in your campus dorm. We asked a number of questions about stereotypes and intergroup attitudes. And I should say we've included 8 groups as sort of the target groups. So we have 4 religion groups: Mormons, evangelical Christians, Muslims, and Mormons, evangelical Christians, Muslims, and Catholics. Gay men and lesbians. And then we also included Black peers and Latino peers as sort of a counterpoint, because there's been a lot of intergroup relations work around attitudes toward Black people and Latino people, especially in the US. So we just sort of are thinking of those as more of a control. We have a social issues measure that we developed that ask about things like gay marriage, about burning the holy book of somebody else's religion, and so a whole host of things about sort of political and social issues. And then we have a whole host of measures of sexual prejudice and beliefs about homosexuality, because that's one of the primary questions we're asking. Today I'm going to just share a slice of data with you from the judgments about and reasoning about excluding others. So this is what we do. We give them a story. Chris goes to college at Purdue University. Chris is a pretty good student and is fairly involved in campus activities, particularly student leadership. Chris is Mormon. At a national conference for college student leaders, some of the other students are forming a group to go to dinner and socialize, and they don't want Chris to go. And as I said, we have stories about these 8 different groups. So Pat is a Catholic, Mark is a gay male, Mary is a lesbian, Sammy is a Muslim, but the same exact story. And then we say, do you think it's all right or not all right that the other students wouldn't want to hang out with Chris? 1, exclusion is completely all right, so it's completely okay for them to do that. 5, exclusion is completely wrong. And then we ask them to write 2 or 3 sentences about why. So this is sort of getting at the reasoning. Why do you think it's okay or not okay? So just to give you a sense of our sample, this is across the religion measures, so the religiosity, spirituality, and fundamentalism measures. And what you can see is that for most of the religiously identified students, they're about at the same level in that religion measure, except for the Mormon students who tend to be a little higher on those measures. And the non-affiliated students tend to, as you would imagine, be a little lower on some of those measures. In terms of the religious life inventory, where there are subscales about intrinsic orientation, extrinsic orientation, and quest, again, fairly comparable in terms of the levels of religiosity across the religiously identified individuals. Again, the LDS students slightly higher on intrinsic orientation, which is sort of an individual personal belief of why you use or how you use religion, as opposed to extrinsic. It gets you extrinsic rewards, social capital, things like that. And quest is this scale that's really about the search for meaning and truth, sort of an attitude of exploration and inquiry. So in terms of these measures, across most of these religion measures, higher scores, so more religiosity, more spirituality, were significantly related to higher endorsement of exclusion as wrong, and higher levels of comfort interacting with diverse others, different others. There's 2 caveats to that, 2 divergences. The data were exactly opposite for judgments about gay and lesbian peers across all of the measures of religion. And the religious life inventory measure functioned a little differently. Quest had an opposite effect. So if you were high on quest, you were a little bit lower on some of the other scales, right? So part of what we are learning and wanting to say about these data is that religion actually serves as a source of compassion and tolerance in many people's lives. And we can explore what that means across sexual orientation categories in the discussion if we want to. This is exclusion by religious affiliation or religious denomination. And what I want to say about this slide is that there are no means for any religious group under 4. Every single group is saying exclusion based on a social identity category is wrong. Not just wrong, but pretty wrong, right? Nobody's even really close to the mean. We do see slight differences between some of the religious affiliation groups, but overall, the emerging adults in our sample are saying exclusion based on this is wrong, right? Which for us was sort of surprising. And for me in particular, that the Mormons were saying this about gay and lesbian people was pretty surprising, although they're lower on that one, right? So let me share with you why we may be finding those things. So we also have all this reasoning data. So we have 1,400 participants. We have them reasoning about 16 different stories, 8 on exclusion, 8 on judgment. So these are just a sampling based on some rude kind of rubric we used in terms of what we're seeing emerge in the data. So we see a lot of these responses around human equality, respect, and compassion across all religiously identified individuals and toward all of the different 8 categories we asked about. So he's human despite his beliefs, and you can see who said it about whom underneath the quote there. Muslim people are usually very friendly and caring. They are humans just like anyone else and have high values, a Protestant participant said. People need to be nice to Mitch, even if he is gay. He is a human being, and everybody needs to be treated equally. A Mormon participant said that about a gay target. Because you cannot let cultures or religions divide us, we should all search to see the uniqueness in each other so that we can find the truth, which is what we are all searching for, about a Mormon by a Protestant participant. So this is a large set of the kinds of responses we're getting from these emerging adults. We also have this category we're calling values difference, but exclusion still wrong. So there were students who said, yeah, we're different, but that still doesn't justify exclusion, right? So even though I have never met an evangelical Christian I have gotten along with, I still think everyone deserves a chance for us to get to know him. That's a non-affiliated participant. They have a right to be freaked out by Mitch's gayness, but that shouldn't really be the only factor in their decision to hang out with him. Chris is not different from anyone else. He may be a different religion and have a different beliefs, but who is to say he's going to act any different or affect them by being Mormon? So there was another large set of responses like this. We understand that we're different, but that doesn't give us the right to exclude, tell a joke, that kind of thing. And then we have these sort of values difference but conflict, right? And this was a smaller set of the sample, and we're still coding these data, so I can't give you any numbers of percentages, but just intuitively this feels like a smaller set of responses. So some people's religions don't mix. So we're different and we don't get along. It is your right as an American to choose your friends. If you do this because of religion, so be it. I personally look at Muslim religion in a different light than other religions. I believe they subjugate women more so than any other culture or religion, and that disgusts me. So another set of responses like this, again, across the groups, but these kinds of responses were more directed more toward Mormons, evangelical Christians, Muslims, and gay and lesbian people. So the more stigmatized in what I consider the more stigmatized groups in our society. And then we have this category we call values threat or discomfort. And these are students who are saying, you know, I'll include him if he doesn't push his beliefs on me, if he doesn't threaten my way of being, right? So if Chris does not try to push his beliefs on others, Chris is Mormon. Then it would be wrong to have a bias against him for something that he believes in. And we had other students who said, but if he did try to push his beliefs, then it would be okay to exclude him, right? Personally, I prefer not to be around gay people, nothing personal against them, but I just dislike when a man sounds like a woman and dresses like her too. I don't like seeing that. I also don't want to be associated with people like that in public. So there's this inherent sense of this would be threatening to me as a person, right? That if someone saw me with a person like that, something bad would happen to me. I think it would be somewhat all right because Muslims tend to have very strong religious beliefs, so that might make the situation uncomfortable. So we saw a lot more of words around uncomfort, discomfort than this stronger language around sort of they would be a threat to me, but it's still that same kind of idea, right? They're going to push their beliefs on me. People are going to think something about me because I've been seen with this person. And so that's just a little sort of sample of what we're learning. We have a lot of work to do and a long journey ahead of us because this is just a few of the measures we're looking at. But one of the things we're really thinking about and grappling with is sort of this first story we want to tell from these data is more a story back here of compassion, equality, respect for others who are different, right? And this may be particularly unique to emerging adults, right? That they're at a unique developmental period, and that once they move on or before they become emerging adults, we may see a different story, but that's something we're sort of thinking about, right? So then what I want to do in closing is present some thoughts that have come up for me in thinking about this talk and looking at the data and running some analyses that I hope will guide some of the discussion or contribute in some way to the conversation we're having today. The first question is, what can we learn about religious conflict and peacemaking by studying religion from a psychological and particularly a developmental perspective? In his recent book, Beyond Religion, His Holiness the Dalai Lama writes, though religion certainly has the potential to help people lead meaningful lives, it too, when misused, can become a source of conflict and divisions. And later on, he goes on to say, ultimately, that's the source of that problem is at the level of the individual. I agree with this to some extent. What we've heard earlier today, this morning, and last night, that there is also a systemic level that we need to pay attention to, but that there is some importance to attending to the individual level when we're talking about these issues. If we can better understand the ways that individuals use religion in their daily lives and decision-making, if we can better understand the individual and contextual factors that lead some individuals to use their faith or religion in ways that are divisive and promoting of conflict, versus other individuals that use their faith or religion to open their hearts and compassion to others and to work to decrease the suffering of others, we may find better ways of promoting peacemaking and reducing conflict among humanity. I would also like to add here that within a psychological study of these issues, a particularly fruitful line of research is and will continue to be the investigations of the developmental underpinnings of these two distinct understandings or approaches to religion that I've just mentioned, as well as the factors related to these divergent developmental pathways. For example, are there critical periods in the development of religion and religious belief that impact how an individual makes sense of the role of religion, both in one's own life and in the world? And how does this development connect to or diverge from moral development as we more classically study it in developmental psychology? In his memoir, Acts of Faith, The Story of an American Muslim, Ibo Patel, who is the founder of the Interfaith Youth Corps, explores a set of ideas about how conservative and fundamentalist faith traditions do a much better job of socializing young people into religious life because they understand that young people, particularly during early and middle adolescence, have a basic developmental need to find meaning and purpose in their lives. And I should add here that he has this theory both about conservative religious traditions, but also other fundamentalist types of groups like neo-Nazis and people like that. But his primary set of examples in the book is around conservative religious traditions. So, for example, through religious training and socialization into the doctrine and belief system of the Taliban, primarily in the context of the jihad, fundamentalist Muslim groups meet the developmental needs of young people. Patel contrasts this practice with the attitudes and practices of more mainstream and or progressive faith traditions toward young people that keep young people at the periphery of the faith as decision makers and participants, and that as social institutions, these religions don't provide supported and integrated mechanisms for young people to find meaning and purpose in their lives. In addition, I think developmental psychology provides us with a rich history of research on morality and the development of a sense of right and wrong, as well as a number of compelling frameworks for understanding both how individuals make and find meaning in their lives, but also how contextual factors and social institutions, such as churches, synagogues, religious institutions, are related to that meaning making. So I think developmental psychology has a lot to contribute to this conversation. My second set of questions or set of thoughts has to do with the multifaceted nature of religion, both as a construct and also in terms of how individuals use religion in their everyday lives. As we've heard already today, religion is and can be many things. It can be an individual set of beliefs and practices that informs decisions that individuals make in their everyday encounters with others. It can be an institution that provides dictates and doctrine regarding the right course one's life ought to take if one is to reach enlightenment. It can be a social and economic enterprise that benefits individuals both within institutions and outside institutions. It can be a community that provides support. It can be a process or a framework through which individuals make and find meaning in their lives. It can be connected to national and political identity, bounded by geography or region, and something that distinguishes groups from each other. Simply put, religion functions in many and diverse ways, both within individuals and within society. By better understanding this, we can begin to tease apart the ways in which religion leads to greater levels of conflict among people and greater levels of human suffering, as well as the ways in which religion leads to greater levels of compassion, social justice, human equality, and equity. Related to this, for me, is also the idea of intersectionality. That is, religion is one piece of, one facet of both individuals and societies. In that sense, religion is also one facet of the extreme types of injustice, inequity, and conflict that we see around the world. Religion as both an individual belief system as well as a social system intersects with other factors such as poverty, national identity, politics, social, physical, and natural resources, and geography in contributing to human conflict, injustice, and suffering. Understanding these intersections at both the individual and the societal level is extremely critical, in my view, to our understanding of how to move toward peacemaking and toward a more just and compassionate world. Which leads me to my last sort of set of thoughts, and that is, what do we mean by conflict? How do we understand this word in the context of religion, and how do we ascribe meanings to it? And further, how can a reframing of this construct impact how we think about religious conflict and peacemaking? And I have to admit, this question came to me rather late in my thinking about this talk, In fact, it came to me Monday night as I was driving home from class, teaching my doctoral seminar on adolescent development. The topic we were covering was social cognition. So I'd spent the previous 3 hours engaged in discussion and dialogue about topics as far-ranging as civic identity and participation, morality, peer exclusion, and social systems and hierarchy. And thinking about all of these ideas, particularly in relation to my ever-present thoughts about this talk, it occurred to me that within developmental psychology, particularly around cognition and social cognition, conflict is actually a good thing. Conflict in the form of disequilibration is hypothesized as one of the key or critical processes that leads to transformation and growth, or in our terms, the development of a more sophisticated system. So let me explain. When an individual's perception of the external world does not match her internal understanding of and ascribed meaning to that world, then disequilibration occurs. This pushes the individual into a place of discomfort and motivates the individual to equilibrate or make peace between the external world and the internal understanding of the world. The individual can do this in one of two ways. The individual can essentially force the external world to fit into the current and existing internal structures and understanding. Conversely, the individual can essentially embrace the discomfort and attempt to come to new understanding of the world through reflection and transformation of the existing internal structures. Within developmental psychology, we postulate that this second type of reaction by the individual is what leads to developmental change or growth. So what makes this type of conflict different from the type of conflict we usually think about when we talk about religious conflict? Most apparent is that this type of conflict is intra-psychological conflict. That is, occurring solely within the individual herself. The individual is the sole actor. When we talk about religious conflict, we are most often referring to interpersonal or intergroup conflict, in which there are multiple and diverse actors. So this may render this type of conflict more complex. However, I would argue that there is another reason why, within developmental psychology, conflict can and often does function as a positive thing that leads to growth and transformation. And that is because in most cases, this type of conflict is occurring in an environment of inquiry and wonder. An environment in which the overarching goal is meaning-making and developing greater understanding through one's experiences, which in many cases is not the type of environment in which religious conflict is occurring. But what if we were to try to reframe our understanding of religious conflict in this way? That is, that conflict in and of itself is neutral. It is what the conflict motivates individuals or groups to do that can lead to greater levels of injustice and human suffering, or greater levels of compassion, understanding, forgiveness, that is, greater levels of individual and social transformation. When we are confronted with difference in the world, whether it be religious or otherwise, do we as individuals or groups attempt to force the other into our existing structures or frameworks or understandings in order to reduce the conflict within ourselves or in the situation? Or do we approach the difference from a place of inquiry and wonder and an openness to being transformed by the other or the difference? This, to me, is a critical factor in what leads religious difference or conflict to result in human suffering and injustice versus human welfare, social transformation, and ultimately peace. In church this past Sunday, my minister, Alan Taylor, was discussing the relationship between religion and science. In the sermon, he drew upon Rabbi Abraham Heschel's book, as well as the book in God in Search of Man, A Philosophy of Judaism, as well as the work of Stephen Jay Gould. And in drawing on both of these works, he said, fundamentally, religion and science are essentially the same thing, in that at their core, the purpose of both is to find greater meaning in the world through inquiry and wonder, and that it is this attitude of inquiry and wonder, rather than an attitude of strict and literal adherence to dogma, doctrine, or previous dictates, or even data, that we as individuals and as societies ultimately find transformation and transcendence. I am convinced that one of the reasons that Carolyn, Larry, and I became friends and have endured as friends is that as scientists, we all highly value inquiry as a way of finding meaning, and that because of that, we approached our differences with a sense of wonder, respect, open hearts, and compassion. Ultimately, I believe that at its core, this is the fundamental work of peacemaking. And I want to leave you with this quote from one of our participants that I think sort of illustrates or exemplifies that idea. And this was brought up earlier, but because you cannot let cultures or religions divide us, we should all search to see the uniqueness in each other so that we can find the truth, which is what we are all searching for. Thank you. And we have some people to thank, which I'll list here. That's not mine. Ooh, sorry.
So our third and last speaker for this morning is Professor Zakharia. And I had the pleasure of meeting her last summer in a very, very small town in the middle of Austria, Stadtschleining. I'm sure no one has heard of it. And it's where actually the European Peace University is as its building and school. And I had the pleasure of taking a class that Professor Zakharia taught there last summer. And that's how I met her. And I was very impressed by her contribution. And I thought she would be a good addition to our conversation here at the conference. So I invited her. And she was just about to start her new position. She's now assistant professor of comparative education at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. And prior to this position, she was the Middle Eastern Studies postdoctoral fellow at Columbia University in New York and a 20 fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard John Kennedy School of Government. Her recent publications consider the interplay of language policy, collective identity, and human security in schools during and after violent political conflict. These interests stem from over a decade of educational leadership in war-affected contexts. And she currently serves as a consultant for a number of international and governmental organizations on issues related to education, conflict, and peace building. So her talk this morning is entitled Religion, Critical Praxis, and Peace Building Observations from Shi'a School in Lebanon. So a direct product from her work in the field. So welcome to Professor Zakharia.
Thank you for that introduction and for inviting me and giving me an opportunity for us to continue our conversations from last summer. Over the past 15 years, more than 35 countries have experienced armed conflict impacting millions of children, with over 40% of the world's out-of-school children living in conflict-affected countries. In addition, at least 43 million people between 1999 and 2008 were reported to have been displaced by violent conflict. The 2011 Global Monitoring Report on Education for All sought to draw attention to the impact of armed conflict on education, asserting a hidden crisis for reaching fundamental targets towards educating all of the world's children. Viewed as a vital conduit for promoting empowerment and other development benefits, education is widely acknowledged as a means by which economically and socially marginalized children and young people can improve the circumstances of their material poverty. Education can also offer a route through which politically marginalized groups might engage in meaningful participation as members of a collective, whether as citizens or non-citizens. Thus, education can serve as a powerful tool to address issues of structural violence, that is, systemic social injustice that manifests itself as inequality, including unequal power over or participation in decision-making processes and resource distribution, and consequently as unequal life chances. In the context of armed conflict, education also has the potential to mitigate the impact of direct physical violence. By providing support for social and emotional resilience, schools can engage students cognitively, socially, and emotionally to withstand and recover from physical and psychosocial risks and consequences of war. Schools can also offer students an opportunity to envision and plan for a different kind of future. This paper explores schooling for youth and community empowerment and resilience during and after periods of acute violent conflict. Specifically, it considers how schools with explicit faith-based missions might promote educational and peace-building goals by teaching in ways that promote critical reflection, peace-building, and human rights in the context of violent political conflict. Drawing on extensive ethnographic data from a Shi'i Islamic school in Lebanon after the 2006 July war between Hezbollah and Israel, the paper considers how one faith-based school addressed both direct and structural forms of violence within a school whose community was directly impacted by the violence. While faith-based schools and Islamic schools in particular have come under fire in recent years for their perceived role in promoting hatred, narrow conceptions of the other, and even violence, this ethnographic study considers the potential for positive impacts on children and young people in the context of armed conflict and political violence. In doing so, it implicitly questions three widely held assumptions about religious education and Islamic education in particular. The first is that religious education is indoctrination, inimical to critical praxis, which I define here as a dialogic process in which there is reflection and then action based on that reflection with attention to power. The second widely held view centers on the perceived negative influence of religion on peacebuilding or the promotion of rights. So religious education cannot go hand in hand with peacebuilding or human rights. And finally, religious education is viewed as being divisive, inimical to modern values of citizenship, things like national allegiances, democratic engagement, social cohesion, and so on. Indeed, education has two faces in the context of violent conflict, and it can be a driver of conflict and a driver of peace. But the same has been said of religion. The Lebanese educational system in particular is largely a mission-based system and has been characterized by both of these faces. Here, we consider one school's approach to educating children and youth who, at the time of the study, were marginalized by war and displacement and by a history of collective structural violence. In exploring some of the pedagogical practices and features of the school, I consider how a faith-based education might integrate academic, social, and emotional needs to meaningfully address both direct and structural forms of violence. And in doing so, this particular school promotes the empowerment and resilience of youth and their community, suggesting elements of a framework for what I call a dynamic community empowerment model of schooling. Through this form of schooling, students and teachers are engaged as agents in personal and community development, as individuals, and as a collective, and the paper concludes by trying to draw out some of these elements for further consideration. So Lebanon's long history of civil and sectarian strife can't be summarized today, but it's inextricably linked to a broader history of regional, cross-border, national, and localized armed conflicts. External regional tensions combined with internal tensions and disparities have contributed to violent conflicts throughout the past 6 decades, and these have been significantly influenced by regional dynamics, including Lebanon's central position within the Arab-Israeli conflict and protracted Israeli and Syrian occupations. These conflicts have contributed to the development of a differentiated, sect-based educational system, which has been attributed with divisiveness, and at the same time, the sectarian nature of education has also been credited with the resilience of the education system, being able to rebuild after every instance of destruction. So today, the majority of students attend parochial schools, and while these schools follow the government curriculum, they also have latitude to teach religion and other subjects. Importantly, in the post-Civil War period, schools do not share a history curriculum. Each is left on their own to teach their own history to their own populations. So for the Shiite, the focus of this study, inequalities in education date back to the earliest emergence of schools in Lebanon. By the early 1800s, European and American missionary and colonial powers with competing interests in the Ottoman-controlled region of Lebanon had begun to establish Christian missionary schools for their particular religious communities. Influenced by the success of this endeavor, the Ottoman authority also opened schools for Sunni Muslims based on the French Catholic exemplar, but with Islamic features. The Shi'i Muslims, however, were excluded from the educational developments of this period. Under Sunni Ottoman rule, they were often persecuted, and their material and educational development was ignored by colonial and missionary enterprises. At independence from the French colonial mandate in 1943, the confessional or sect-based political system perpetuated the underrepresentation of the Shia in government and later in post-independence development. This system institutionalized sectarianism as the primary form for accessing resources, and thus reinscribed unequal development and also collective deprivation of the Shia. Today, the Shia Muslims in Lebanon comprise one of 18 officially recognized religious sects as a population that has been historically marginalized politically and economically and socially. Their educational movement is more recent. The 2006 July war between Hezbollah and Israel and the internal political violence that followed set the context for this study. The 34-day war was extremely destructive, killed over 1,000 civilians, injured over 4,000. 1 million people were displaced, and of these, 600,000 were sheltered in schools. And so we see the connection between schooling and conflict in multiple ways. The war devastated civilian infrastructure, including 342 schools, with an estimated $45 million in war damages to education. These schools were disproportionately Shi'i educational institutions. In the academic year that followed, this is when I entered this school, the period of 2006 to 2007 was also characterized by post-war recovery and reconstruction, as well as internal political violence and upheaval. We're talking about a kind of environment of political insecurity that prevailed through a number of assassinations, violent protests, roadside bombs, and so on, and all of these caused daily disruptions to schooling. So this period of violence and upheaval was particularly poignant for students and teachers at this Shi'i school, mainly because many of the students had lost friends or family during the 2006 July war, and the school had taken on a number of orphans as part of its mission. In addition, there were many internally displaced persons who lived in temporary housing following the destruction of their homes. I want to stay here. So it was in the classrooms that my attention was first drawn to the content and form of education at the school. Not only did teachers work with students to critically analyze issues of significance to peace and human rights, but they also taught in ways that invited critical reflection, creative undertakings, and reconsideration of values. In particular, critical reflection was central. It was a central tenet that involved rational, spiritual, and emotional considerations, reflecting on the self, reflecting on the community and the other, while recognizing differences. I began to sit in hallways and the library to witness these undertakings in alternative spaces. I observed extracurricular activities, community events, social action projects. I followed the students throughout their days. I read the walls, which consistently bore new student projects undertaken through collaborative group work. And through these daily interactions, I came to observe the multiple ways in which teachers and students together contended with direct and structural violence, both in and out of class, in turn negotiating individual and community empowerment and resilience within a faith-based ecology. Now, I need to underscore here that the original study was about language policy and this was one of 10 schools that I was visiting. So what I'm going to describe here is data or observations that emerged even though I was looking at something else. This school was first established as a girls' school in '97, and it later grew to include boys and gender-segregated classrooms. At the time of the study, it enrolled 2,500 Shi'i students, grades K through 12, and it followed the national curriculum in Arabic, English, and French. It was run by an explicit faith-based organization and mission by and for Shia, And while it was open to all students and all teachers, its spiritual and school leadership and the teachers who taught there and the support staff and the attendant population were all Shia. So as part of its religious mission, the school held bi-weekly religion classes and daily morning prayers. But also, religion permeated the sort of less structured areas of the school, which I will begin to describe. As a community-centered institution, the school both taught the national curriculum and engaged students in community-centered issues as part of its vision for personal and community empowerment and development. Teachers and administrators came from the community, and they were engaged in their own learning as well as their professional development, as well as the development of the community through a variety of community outreach and education efforts. The focal school viewed itself as a school that was engaged in a struggle for community development, as expressed in school literature by teachers and administrators. The notion of development or progress, commonly articulated among teachers and administrators and parents, included both material and spiritual progress. This vision of progress included an element of individual and community empowerment, emerging from intellectual progress achieved through a process of inquiry and critical reflection. Such notions reflected the teachings of the school and the community's spiritual leader. The spiritual leadership of the school played a significant role in guiding its educational principles, including reformist ideas about religion and gender, encouraging, for example, spiritual development through inquiry and interpretation, and the active engagement of women and girls in their community. Indeed, faith, as I mentioned, permeated the school in instructional content and form, and it was also present in visible and symbolic ways. For example, above each blackboard was written Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Of course, student uniforms, things like posters on walls, student artwork, the ways in which they greeted each other, Assalamu alaikum, etc. In these many multiple forms, faith permeated the ways in which the school operated, but also in the ways that it contended with direct and structural violence, which is what I will turn to now with some illustrative examples. The school employed a number of different ways to contend with direct violence and to mitigate the effects of direct violence on the community. And these efforts were integrated into classroom activities as part of curricular content, but they were also part of extracurricular activities and activities that involved the community. One illustration of how direct violence was engaged through academic content and form involved a writing project for elementary school students. They were in a French class, and this is at the start of the 2006-2007 academic year. During the summer war of the previous months, images by Associated Press photographer Sebastian Scheiner had been widely circulated in the media and over the internet. And if you were at the talk yesterday, you saw one of the images in Professor Abu-Nimer's presentation. The images, taken at a heavy artillery position in northern Israel, showed Israeli girls writing messages, presumably to their Lebanese counterparts, on shells, similar to those that were launched into southern Lebanese villages. So students who were learning French as a second language in this school were asked to write letters in French in response to the Israeli children in these images. According to the French language coordinator, at first, we let them free write whatever they wanted or needed to say. After the free write, we examined the letters, which, as you can imagine, were terrible as a first reaction. Then we engaged students in a conversation about their responses. So during the discussion and the reflection process that followed, teachers and students talked about their feelings and drew on religious understanding to develop their ideas about violence. We discussed how Islam and Judaism are above this and do not allow for this kind of response. We cannot allow ourselves to be dragged down by our circumstances, but rather we must rise above as our religions dictate. So, according to the French language coordinator, they had them rewrite the letters after this conversation, this process of reflection and dialogue, and the new letters were more thoughtful and reflected greater understanding and a processing of emotions, such as sadness, hatred, fear, And thus, through writing and discussion and reflection, including reflections on faith, teachers addressed the psychosocial impact of the 2006 July War on their particular faith community, while meeting the academic writing goals of the national curriculum for French language acquisition. In the teachers' words, they employed the writing curriculum as a vehicle for trauma intervention and as an opportunity for students to reflect critically on their attitudes towards violence. It was not only in this particular writing project that teachers addressed the impact of direct violence, it was also in other lessons through a variety of research, writing, and performance projects. In all of these instances, teachers attended to social and emotional needs such as fears of resumed hostilities, while bringing these concerns into the academic process. In this way, across the curriculum, they engaged students in thinking about militarism, terrorism, human rights violations, and other forms of direct violence that were impacting their community. I'll turn to some visual data here, and students were also involved in art therapeutically at multiple ages. This is an art project, for example, that was done in the primary grades where students cut photographs of destroyed buildings that belonged to their faith community and stuck them on a poster board. And then they, as you can see, painted on top of them pictures of flowers and butterflies and suns and things that, multicolored images, superimposed on the physical destruction to help work through ideas of community resilience. This collage was exhibited at the Spring Art and Book Fair, which was visited by family and community members. So you could argue that there's an extension of this kind of projection from young people about resilience to the larger community. The school also contended with direct violence through the development of relevant skills in and out of class. For example, they addressed survival skills, landmine awareness. They distributed brochures that would be taken home to explain what to do in various situations in the context of war and so on. Let's move to structural violence and look at a couple of examples here. The school addressed structural violence through an infused social justice curriculum that attended to various forms of oppression related to gender, race, ethnicity, poverty, religious belief, political freedom, nationality, citizenship status, among other things. I had the opportunity to actually observe lessons on all these different things. Teachers and students also engaged with economic, social, cultural, and political rights through instructional content, critical and participatory pedagogy, and through events and celebrations. Furthermore, the school focused on skill development related to cross-cultural communication, community activism, and leadership. They actively taught leadership skills, communication skills, languages, and so on as part of this larger vision of community development and empowerment. So, as with direct violence, the engagement then with structural violence was evident in aspects of the school's instructional content, the instructional form, the way that they taught in the classroom, the kinds of skills that they were trying to develop with students, and the educational support structures that extended to students and their families and the wider community. So among, for example, the themes that were widely taught in the school's secondary school, in the secondary girls' activities, I should say, were around gendered relations. So in one lesson, grade 10 girls explored male-female relations through an activity in which students negotiated differing views within the class community about their relationships with their male counterparts. And the whole format of the class was very interesting. The teacher selected students who reflected very different views about male-female relationships. She knew their families, so perhaps she had a sense of what their positioning was on this. And she had them come up in kind of like, there was like a panel, and the class sat in a circle, and they questioned the panelists about their views. And those panelists then had to sort of defend their views to the students. And the teacher was also involved in the questioning. So she draws on their experiences with friendship and marital engagement. One of the young women was engaged at the age of 16 already. And she uses their words as the instructional text, as the text. That's the text that they're going to read and analyze. And I saw this in multiple classrooms where the text to be analyzed was taken from the students themselves. So they speak, and this becomes the text for analysis, and then she encourages critical reflection on different ways of establishing relationships with men. So notably, she's drawing on very different views within the class community, and then she establishes a norm, a value. And that norm is for the empowered partner. So one who develops her autonomous power while developing interdependence with another person. There were many other lessons of this nature. Students went and researched women in public office, the impact of the Iraq War on Iraqi refugees in Lebanon, et cetera, and they were involved in this kind of inquiry process of research, interviewing, and bringing back the data to discuss and to reflect on their own views. So at the same time that they're doing this, they're also considering the constraints that have been placed on their gender and how these might be renegotiated in tandem with their religious values. We see this stuff happening across the ages. Here we have, for example, books written by students displayed on tables at the annual book fair. So this is the annual book fair. Publishers come and put their books out there, but the student books are also on the tables near the publishers. We have also students, as I mentioned, learning a number of public speaking skills and presenting things like next to officials at the UNESCO Education for All event and educating the community and also soliciting their parents and family to come back to school through the literacy programs that the school provides for parents. So we see this kind of collaborative group work, critical participatory dialogue, as well as social action projects emerging from the classrooms. And so they were encouraged to link their learning to specific community-centered projects, whether it involved their faith community or other communities that they felt shared common situations of oppression. Let's look at one more example. In one Arabic lesson, secondary school girls engaged in a book talk led by a student in the school library. The student introduced the book's author as a communist when proclaiming communist beliefs was illegal in the Arab world. And she explained that the author was imprisoned and tortured for his beliefs, which he eventually rescinded by signing a statement to end his suffering, to end his torture. He rescinded his beliefs. And then she leads this animated discussion, and the students have a really tough time with this. No one should rescind their beliefs. And so at the same time, the issue of political imprisonment and the significance of political and religious freedoms for the well-being of society and the principles of democracy, all of these things in the context of largely non-democratic countries of the Middle East, all arise as part of the discussion. The Arabic teacher and librarian help the discussion along. They say to the students, we have to understand that just as we have our beliefs and ideas and opinions, others have theirs, and we must accept their right to have them and voice them. And from an Islamic point of view, too, to accept the other and the other's point of view. We cannot dream of a real civil society otherwise. So here we're seeing a conversation happening between religious and other belief systems, like communist beliefs, interplaying with what it means to be part of a real democratic or civil society. Now, I want to say, there were some students in the group who couldn't deal with it. And actually, after the discussion, there was one girl in particular who went aside and said to the teacher, I just can't accept it. I can't accept that other people have different views than myself. And the teacher and the librarian addressed this individual student aside in a very loving way and said to her, kind of maybe as perhaps a parent might advise a child, you really need to think about this and whatever, and ended it with a joke and twisting her ear, sort of like saying, you need to think about this. So in addition to having these sort of instructional types of setups, there was also the personal and relational aspect to this teaching and learning that allowed them to push certain kinds of boundaries with the students. I want to give you just one more example now to talk about how the school addressed forms of cultural violence, or those forms of violence, both direct, cultural violence can be direct, or it can be structural, that relate to a group's religion, language, ethnicity, or other perceived cultural attributes that then lead to forms of direct violence against that group, or structural violence against that group. So in one grade 10 history class, for example, students explored Christianity as part of their history class. And one student, as part of her project for the class, did a video documentary, or a video taking people's opinions by video about a central question that she was exploring, which was whether Christ was indeed crucified. This is a central, contentious debate. And so she said to me, since you're coming from the US, perhaps you will offer another perspective on the issue. Will you be one of my interview subjects? And I accepted. And then on the day of the interview, she seated me there and she set up her little camera and she went through sort of the consent protocol and she asked me the questions. And it was really quite striking. Most of my graduate students don't have that much grace in their interview skills. And then she posed some key questions for me. So in this class, students were examining a major point of contention, right, for Muslims, whether Christ was crucified. Rather than being told the answer to this question, and even though there is a particular view coming from this faith community, they were to explore it by asking and by going through a form of religious interpretation for themselves, engaging in what we call ijtihad, or a process of legal deliberation and independent interpretation based on Islamic legal sources, the Quran and the Sunnah. At the same time, the students were tying this process to historical research. One of the key questions she asked me was whether I thought disagreement about the crucifixion has led to present-day conflict. So there was a connection being made. It wasn't just a question about what happened in the past, but it was a question about whether the interpretation of what happened in the past has led to current-day conflicts. So there's this tying process, right? Historical research, engaging in community-centered, participatory, and democratic dialogue around core issues. And here they were engaging as researchers as well as political participants through content and form. So I'm out of time, so I'm going to do this really fast. We can think about the curriculum as being infused so that we're seeing this kind of teaching around what I would argue is peace-building types of messages infused across the curriculum in instructional content, form, and skill development. And that significantly, we're seeing this as an integrated approach across sort of 4 dimensions that all lead to this kind of youth and community empowerment and resilience within a particular faith community. So significantly, the school was considering both individual and faith and the faith community relationally, I should say, whereby the students and teachers were involved in a struggle for intellectual, material, and spiritual development concurrently as individuals and as a collective. They were reflecting on their own movement as well as the movement of the collective. So within this community-centered model, the content and form of education, including research and social action, are embedded in local struggles, and schooling emerges as a political project. So I would say it's a dynamic community empowerment model of schooling. But it's not just dynamic in the ways that it integrates all of these things at the same time. I would also say that it's dynamic because of, so in addition to so my ideas about what it means to be dynamic is these kind of points here, that it's empowering the individual and the community concurrently. It's not insular, it's inward and outward looking, past and forward looking, resisting the marginal status of the community, and engaging students as learners, teachers, and community activists. But at the same time, I want to end with some tensions by saying it's dynamic because of the phenomenon of regulation that happens in the school. So it raises a question regarding the process of critical praxis. Is what I was observing truly transformative? Is a question. Or was it a process of deliberation and investigation and critical inquiry towards a particular end? So while alternative viewpoints were present among students and teachers and encouraged in class, they were ultimately also regulated. Not only in the general ways that all schools regulate speech and behavior among students, not just through things like, we know, dress code, rules, etc., right? There's always forms of regulation in schools from the top down, but also among the students themselves and among the teachers. They regulated each other. For example, I witnessed various instances of students and teachers monitoring appropriate dress among themselves, even though teachers did not agree what was appropriate. So in one interview, a teacher told me she thought it was wrong to force all teachers and students to wear the hijab. She said, maybe it's fine to have a uniform for students, but for teachers, really? Are you kidding me? What are they trying to do? Etc. So there was a spectrum of political, religious, and other beliefs and customs, and these were being critically engaged inside of and outside of class, ultimately with the school community. And it also played a role in monitoring and regulation at the same time. So religion and faith were being negotiated, I would say, in every instance within the personal and the relational, and also in the engagement of curriculum and content that was tied to community-centered concerns, including individual and collective agency for social change. I'm going to leave you with one concluding thought, and actually it messes up the whole paper a little bit. But so while the dynamic community empowerment model of schooling holds great promise for peace building, it's important to note that other intervening factors constrain the actions of school actors and ultimately the futures of children and young people who have been affected by war and structural violence. Ultimately, schools operate within a social and political matrix. Furthermore, questions arise around certain practices that I also observed in the school. For example, students were engaged in, as part of history, to write about martyrs from their community. These are posters, for example, big posters that are on the walls, exhibiting student work. They've done snapshot biographies on various martyrs from the community. On the one hand, you could argue that this is local forms of history, local heroes, arguably a display of empowerment for an underserved community. On the other hand, it might be viewed as inculcating ideas of heroism around violence. So there are tensions, right? There are tensions with which I will leave you. But still, I want to say that the case study actually gives us an opportunity to reflect on these tensions in a particular way, simply because we may have preconceived ideas about this community to begin with, and so how we try to take in this new information and how we interrelate with this information may point a lot to the types of questions we should be asking in future. Thank you very much.
We have, here it is. We have approximately 10-15 minutes for some discussion about these three papers. I think the three of them in different ways challenge our binary of violence and religion, and offer some ways of thinking about that and rethinking these terms and rethinking especially the relationship between these two terms. So we had the first paper addressing more the question of how religious values and beliefs and representation have shaped national identity in the case of the US. The second paper more about intergroup and interpersonal relationship and how religious beliefs shape individual identities and processes of exclusion and inclusion among groups. And then finally, the last paper about the role of religious values and religious principle contributing possibly to some kind of peace education and responses to violence in very, very clear conflict zones. So three levels of religious beliefs and their role in shaping identities and shaping responses to understanding of violence and conflict. So I'll open the floor to whoever wants to ask a question or has a question to ask. And if you do, please come to the microphone in front. No.
I had a question for Stacey. Stacey, I thought that your control has to be not the Latino and the African group, but actually your control has to be United States versus parts of the world where you do not have communities which have large groups of people from other parts of the world. And I'm not really convinced by the idea that religion and morality are two separate things. I think you have to realize, or maybe we have to realize that the fact that the gay and the lesbian community has made such great strides in kind of creating place for themselves in the civic society that it has opened up our hearts, all right? The same when there's a one-to-one interaction, when there's a one-to-one interaction between a Mormon and a Muslim and a lesbian and a Catholic, it's a very different thing. And I think that critique of your work would be carried both in John's and Zeena's presentations as well, that when you look at societies which are actually having that kind of interaction, you have a very different phenomenon. But when you have communities which are closed in on themselves, and if you ask the same people what they think about Afghans, right, with whom they have no interaction, and they see them as a kind of an abstract entity somewhere across the pond. Then the question of this, what John was referring to in a very different context about American exceptionalism kind of comes in, that you have these two water bodies around you which situate very different things. So I think that is something that has to be brought into developmental psychology as kind of the question of context itself. So that was my comment.
Yeah, I would agree, and I would say my point about religion and morality is not that they're not overlapping constructs, but that from a scientific study of them, part of our conceptual framework is to treat them as distinct and overlapping, and that religion have conventions associated with them that don't have to do with morality, and so they have these pieces that are sort of separate, but not that they're distinct, particularly in how people live out their own lives, right? They certainly overlap for individuals. And the critique is great. This is a very U.S. sample. It's a very U.S.-focused study, and that's certainly a limitation of the project. Yeah, absolutely.
Do you want to react? Same question. No. Anyone else? Yes, you, please. It's also because we're recording some of the discussion, so the microphone is helpful.
I'd like to ask Zeena to what extent the students at the school had the opportunity to develop friendships among some of the different factions in Lebanon. Was there any opportunity for that at all?
That's a great question. At the time of the study, no. At the time of the study, there was so much insecurity that it was not possible to do that. And this school did have a segregated community. In other words, there were no non-Shia at the school, so the school often provides a space where that might happen. But in this case, no. As I mentioned, it's not that the school didn't accept other students, it's that in Lebanon there's a distinct idea that while all people of all kinds of faith may go to Christian schools, the opposite is not true. Christians will not choose to go to Islamic schools because it's based in a history of Christian schools being better. So the extent to which they were able to interact outside the school had, in that particular period, it was very difficult. There are other Islamic schools, though, who were engaged in this kind of, they were also segregated because of these choices that families make, partly because of the conflict, but who were connecting with other schools in order to have the children be able to interact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I taught at the American University during the Civil War, and that was a great opportunity for students from the many different factions to get to know one another well.
Absolutely.
And that's very important.
And that has continued to be an extremely important space in which young people then will interact. So while it may not happen for them in their school years, it will happen for them often, not always, at the university level. If they go to one of the American universities, certainly that's going to happen for them. This school, the best of their students possibly could go to the American university if they had financial aid.
Thank you.
I have just one question for Stacey. By the way, I thought your study was fabulous. It was very...
stay tuned.
Very, very
Stay tuned.
Yeah. My question was in your survey. It seemed to me you had your survey questions and then you had your statements. And there was a bit of a disparity there. And I thought you might be getting pro-social answers on your survey, or with social reactivity, people wanting to say what's expected of them. And I was just wondering how you're going to deal with that, because illuminating the difference between the two I thought would be informative.
Yeah, that's a good point. We have a very large, well, for me, as a developmental psychologist, 1,400 students is a very large sample. The survey was online and very anonymous, so the students were often taking it by themselves in their own, space where they have their computer, and it was completely unidentified. And so, as much as we can say that they were answering somewhat honestly, but there is always that sense of social desirability. And we know that for hypotheticals, people do try to respond in the way they think they ought to. But we are getting these other comments around stereotypes and dissension and this sort of sense of threat that I think is at the core of sort of when people start to sort of take themselves away or off. So it's a good critique. I don't know how we can talk about it. And certainly we are finding differences between the religious identity groups, significant differences. So I think the story is a complex one that's going to have to unfold over a length of time. But since, I have to sort of give the caveat that we really just have the data in a place that we can start to analyze it within the last 3 weeks. And so this is sort of probably I pulled out the things I wanted to see, right, in a sense. And so that's why I say stay tuned. The conversation will probably become more complex.
Thank you. I think it's a very wonderful study.
Yeah. And just to add on, you raised the point of contact, and I think in the U.S., particularly in college, people are in contact with other people who are different, and that's a critical component that we have to talk about, because we know intergroup contact under certain conditions is what facilitates this sense of being able to sort of talk across difference. I thought the talk last night talked about that, and so that's a very good critique that kind of comes. Absolutely, yeah.
We probably have time for one more questions in the back.
Thank you. This may be most relevant to Professor Horn. I took many students to India over the years, and we studied Indian government and observe the country. And the issue of violence in India is deep, as you know. And the conundrum that I think we saw was that people in villages who know each other and follow your idea, Muslim, Hindu, doesn't matter. But you give them one reason, a big religious reason maybe, and they spark violence. In Gujarat and Iota, some of the recent tragedies, let alone what happened when India became independent. And that's always fascinated me, that person to person we can like people, get along with them, and then it blows. And is there any insight that you've been able to develop in your research, or the others on the panel, that talks about this hair trigger that occurs, sometimes over something as deeply felt, I suppose, but seems almost ridiculous, as to whether a temple was built first as a Muslim temple or a Hindu temple?
Anybody else have a response?
I don't have a clear answer, although people are trying to study what these these triggering situations are. I can just say that schools and young people who I study are in this larger political matrix, and we can't look at individuals or schools or what they do or anything else, or interfaith dialogue or contact groups or anything else outside of this larger political matrix that impacts individuals and collectives in different ways. I find it remarkable that high school aged students are able to actually discuss those things differently in very complex ways related to their own preferences or the ways that they view violence, and their ability to critically reflect on their positionality in relation to violence, at the same time seeing themselves as not completely in control of certain things. So developing forms of agency to respond to those triggers would be an area that I'm interested in.
Yeah, and maybe just to add to that, I think the comments made last night around sort of this harmony model, where we say we're all the same and it's sort of cultural sensitivity, my sense is we can't stop there, right? Because once you are confronted then with difference, you don't know how to deal with the fact that you're not all the same, right? So I think these more critical approaches to dialogue, to say inequity exists, structural inequity exists, and we need to understand that. We need to get people in places of privilege and position and power to recognize their own privilege and power. And there's some work going on in Chicago where we have a different kind of conflict and violence happening that isn't directly connected to religion, but we have the most murders this year in Chicago, by the way, in the United States. And one of the things we're looking at in Chicago, particularly among young people, because young people are often the perpetrators of that kind of violence, is how your own past trauma affects when you are triggered. And how do we help people heal beyond their own trauma and heal both individually and collectively from trauma, to a place of reconciliation, and not forgetting, but a place of forgiveness. And so I think all of those things go into the mix of how we understand that. I don't know what we're learning from our study around those issues, but I think one of the criticisms of psychology is that it is more interpersonal, and that we have to look at systemic kinds of things, and we are certainly aware of that criticism. Yeah, so great question.
Let me just add a couple of thoughts. Of course, every situation and context has to be examined, for its in light of its own history and culture and particularities. In the case of India, of course, you've got a multi-religious society that's ostensibly still secular, which is supposed to be what to some extent, many people think about the United States as well. I'm reminded, though, that it's important sometimes to make a distinction between depth of conviction, including depth of one's own conviction, and what we might just call religious literacy, particularly literacy in understanding of other people's religious traditions. And so if you look at much of, one of the things I think all of our papers have touched upon at some point in some ways is that you can have situations in which people are very deeply committed, including people who are fundamentalists, which is not usually a term that is seen, it's oftentimes a pejorative term in a supposedly multicultural society because it's exclusive. But you can have situations with people who have very deep convictions, who are fundamentalists, who are peaceful, law-abiding, tolerant people, don't produce or incite violence. Even I used the example of Falwell and Robertson, who are not tolerant, particularly open-minded people, but they certainly weren't counseling violence. So you can have that kind of real strength and depth of conviction, but that's quite different than having literacy or knowledge, not being ignorant about other people and other people's religious ideas. And that's, I think, where a lot of the problems and misunderstandings really come into place. And so that tends to, I think, that lack of conviction or that lack of literacy tends to be what's most responsible for sort of religious othering, if you will, and the conflicts that come from it. So I think that's a key point to keep in mind.
And I'm going to conclude on that. I think indeed it's a key point to keep in mind, and hopefully the panel this afternoon will extend this discussion, and our lunch session is going to start, and we'll hear a little bit about that.
Yes, there is lunch. Boxed lunches are provided for folks, and it's going to be out here. I think we may have to do a little bit of rearranging. And during lunch, folks are going to be invited, not required, right, but invited to participate in a dialogue session. We've talked a lot about dialogue, talked a lot about talking. We've done a lot of talking. All of us now will have an opportunity to do so. I want to ask David Darazotis from the College of Social Work to talk a little bit about this process.
Hi, you guys. It's good to see some of you. I know some of you already. Just really briefly, because you just did a lot of listening, we're going to have a chance during lunch to talk about our own personal stories a little bit. And what we've discovered in these conferences is when we do that, it brings us together and we find our commonalities. So the idea is that those of you that want to participate while you're eating can sit in the circle. And the question we're going to address is, what incidents of violence have I had in my life? What was a key incident that I experienced or witnessed that brought me to being someone who's interested in working for peace? And so, like I know some of you are from countries that were in war, and I know some of you have had saw violence in your family. So those would be examples of the kinds of things. And if you don't want to participate, that's totally okay, but you're certainly welcome to watch as you eat lunch. Thanks, Muriel.